Well, Libby Purves, thank you so much for your time. We're looking forward so much to your words of wisdom on the subject of interviewing. And I wonder, first of all, given your long experience of working at the BBC, whether you actually did receive any training in interviewing from our revered broadcasting organisation.
No, it was a bit more sort of sitting next to Nelly. You know, you watch the people who are really good at it. You watch the people who are good at broadcasting generally, and the ones you liked and that appealed to you as the kind of person you want to hear on programs, you copied them, and the ones you didn't like, you thought, what a prat, and you didn't copy them. When I was a trainee, I mean a technical trainee, because I was a technical trainee at the BBC, a studio manager, I remember begging, could I go and sit in on the New Year's Eve all-night program that they were doing uh, with John Timpson and Robert Robinson, because I thought Robert Robinson was wonderful. In fact, years later, of course, I worked with John Timpson. But no, I sat in and just watched and saw how it worked and saw how they reacted to people they were having to interview, you know, sort of suddenly. And so you just really, as I say, sitting next to Nelly, it wasn't an actual training thing. The only training really was a degree of sort of just trying to be basically literate and have sentences with verbs in, all that kind of thing. They were quite keen on that.
Yeah, of course they were. But what would you say in your upbringing, maybe your education and other experiences you had in life, which perhaps made you the sort of person who would make a good interviewer? Can we look at that? I mean, I'm particularly interested in the idea, for example, that you came from a diplomat's family and you traveled around the world with him, and that, in a sense, sort of opened you up to new things and made you less likely to be intimidated, perhaps in a recording studio. I don't know.
Oh, yes. And in the days before anyone thought they had to really entertain children at all, you just watched. And as I say, my dad was a diplomat, and I grew up with a sense of listening and also a sense, I think, from him, obviously respecting people's dignity and what they said and what it might mean, and just listening. I was the ordinary sort of chatty child, you know, interrupting and so on, but I was also famous for wanting to listen in to grown-up conversations, sometimes join in if welcome. I like listening to people, so it was a very verbal sort of childhood. And when it came to interviewing, I have to say, though, it was later. The most useful thing, I think, was in my late teens. I was a barmaid every year in the west of Ireland, all through university vacations. I think that when I did midweek on Radio 4, I basically thought, you know, my training for this was being a barmaid. You basically rest your bosom on the table and you listen to people talking about themselves. You don't actually have to draw them pints, but it's the same sort of thing. Sort of, oh, really? Oh, did you really? Oh, well, that. Oh, no, fancy that. You know, that sort of Irish thing. Whether you approved of them or not, and they might be talking complete nonsense, but you were sort of there. And so think that's it. Diplomat and barmaid. That's the way to start.
But you've emphasized there the importance of listening. I mean, there's a famous story told about Studs Terkel. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a New York sort of talk show host for literally decades, and he interviewed absolutely everybody. He produced works of oral history, I know, interviewing people who experienced the Great Depression. And somebody went up to him at an event once and said, Mr. Terkel, I love your work. Please give us some tips on really good interviewing. And he said, thinking for a moment, he said, well, there's four things. First thing is you really got to listen to the person you're interviewing.
Mm,
And
yeah.
then the second thing he said is you really, really got to listen to the person you're interviewing. And of course, three and four were all about listening. But of course, it's saying that is something that a student would think was perfectly obvious. Of course, you got to listen. What type of listening is it? What do we mean by productive listening?
I think it's a non-judgmental listening. You have to not think for even a minute that you're any kind of even distant relative of all the gotcha people, the news interviewers who want a big story. Because apart from anything else, anyone interviewing in that way or in that attitude, no one will ever give you a big story. The big story will always kind of pop in incidentally, sometimes when they wish they hadn't said it. So, I mean, I started on local radio. and I was, again, a techie, I was a studio manager, but I started to do interviews because you do a bit of everything on local radio and then you kind of climb up. And because it was Radio Oxford, great mixture, I had to interview academics. As you know, some of them are really weird. Some crusty elderly dons and some very nervous young ones who were afraid of saying wrong things. And so I had to interview them. I had to interview local novelists and experts. At the same time, ordinary people would be phoning in. So you're always aware that it's not your job to use the kind of long word or long complex question which is going to baffle somebody if they are just the ordinary person. You can do that with your crusty old Don, you can fool him, whatever. But, do not sort of say anything which is going to make anybody feel uncomfortable about talking to you. So I got to that. At the same time, I had a private enthusiasm for people doing their jobs. I went up a crane, I went down the sewers, I sat next to clockmakers and a blanket weaver who began to sing as he wove on his old-fashioned loom. He began to sing the Foggy, Foggy Dew, I am a bachelor, I weave by myself on no work at the weaver's trade. And I was saying, please let the recording machine still be working, please, because he didn't really know he was singing. He wasn't showing off. It was just what he did while he was weaving. So I loved doing all that stuff. And at the same time, I had the luck to also do quite tricky interviews with quite tricky people. And I would cite J.I.M. Stewart, a delightful man in many ways, a Don. He was Michael Innes, the novelist, and I'd interviewed him about his Michael Innes novels. And then he wrote a great big trilogy, quite complicated 3-part novel about the universities, a student's progress through, and that was a bit more highbrow than his others. And I had to interview him again, and I did it for the first book. He came in because local radio, you always get your local celeb in. In he comes, and I got a few, and then the next time, he became more and more sort of short answers and I wouldn't think so, I wouldn't say so. And at the end of it, as he got up in this little studio, he said, well, he said, you didn't get much out of the old boy that time, did you? Which was very patronizing, but actually quite true. And I said, oh, well, maybe not. I said, the listener judges or whatever. I tried to say something. But so, yes, I had people like that. And of course, I had people who could be quite rude back to me. I mean, Alistair Buchan, the son of John Buchan, who I greatly admired, his book and his work and all the rest of it. And at one stage, I said, what role, it was about one of his sort of geopolitics writings. What role do you think Britain can play in this? And he said, I do not allow the language of the green room to be used in the context of war. And then moments later, he said somebody had played a part like Hamlet. But I wasn't going to jump back on him because, again, the point was to get a load of stuff and edit it down later. And we'd get the Buchan interview because we needed it for the morning programme. So all that sort of thing went on. And it was interesting. It was a very good, interesting time, that.
Yeah, well, what comes through from all you're saying there is a certain native curiosity in the Libby Purves mindset. And I'm wondering, from my experience, how far can you really teach curiosity? Are you just a curious person or are you not? I mean, can you teach curiosity, do you think?
I think it's a matter of just being open. I think people are very curious. I mean, I'm a great, in the days people sometimes didn't have a phone and chatted more on trains. You always quite want to know what's going on or what they do in their life, and especially if they do something interesting. The politicians know them. Mrs. Thatcher's famous question was, what's on your mind? Whenever she met anybody, and then she kind of got a line into whatever they were fretting about, which was quite a good line in. What are you doing? I think like dinner party conversation, because as I say, I was brought up in the sort of world where, if you were made to go to dinner with people, with grown-ups and sit next to them, you were going to have to sort of listen to them. So I think it's something which just develops. I think to be totally incurious about other people is an odd thing, and it's not a good thing. But it's the other thing is the business of having a list of questions and having phrased questions, because sometimes somebody is really quite dull because they're simply not getting anywhere that you think could be remotely useful. So everybody always needs go in with a big list of questions, carefully phrased questions, It can be, if people always laugh at the awfulness of reporters saying, "How did you feel?" Well, I think that's a great question, because a bad question is, "Were you very angry?" Because they might not, it might not be, well, not quite angry, but whatever. But how did you feel? Let them name the emotion, whatever it was in their life. Were you happy about that? Questions like that, the how did you feel ones are good. And then you may have to kind of, listening to that, you may have to hop in with, but why? What was it about it? Why was it about the job? You were a Psychomaker's bottom knocker. You were many years on, many years on the road, many years as a tramp, many years as a steel worker, as a shipyard worker. What was it specially? And people will always kind of come down to something a bit special, but you don't give great, long, complicated questions, which make people think, I'm really going to have to think through that. You've got to make it very comfortable.
Students can be tempted into thinking that they should ask longer questions to sort of demonstrate that they know something about the subject. I meet that quite a lot. I mean, you can see the pressure that's on them in that sense, can't you?
It's not just students doing that. I mean, goodness, every morning on the radio, the famous, the James Naughtie, 25-minute question with all the facts in it. And sometimes that's because you're trying to give the background, but it'd be better to have given the background briefly first and not put it in the question. You could just sort of say, Minister, can this be right? Whatever, because shorten your question. So I think the long question is a pity. You can make it a bit more precise by saying, I mean, what's an example that your students might be doing? It might be somebody in a factory. What might be, how early did you start? Was that difficult? How did you travel in? What was the first job of the day? Whatever, you're making shoes or whatever, what was the first job of the day then? How did that work? And I think that all those things can build up, so you just have to have a lot of thinking, what do I want to know here? And you have to be aware of sometimes what the answer is doing to them, because some people have never been listened to by anybody much. Ask any revolutionary, the unheard people. Sometimes the first time anyone's paid any attention to what they're saying and what they feel like and what they mean about life is you. And therefore this might actually be quite an emotional moment for them. So you have to be sort of listening out for that. You don't want to be the cause of them being embarrassed. But on the other hand, you've got to be able to walk with them if they are being. I mean, I've had some very emotional ones.
Yeah, students do get worried. They express their concerns in the sort of any questions section of training. And what happens if we're talking about a fairly emotional subject? What happens if my interviewee does break down in some sort of way? Over to you. How would you cope with a situation where somebody does break down?
Well, I've had one or two drunks, which were tricky. But I think the crying thing is interesting. Because I'm doing it for a program on air, if it was recording and somebody became very overwhelmed, I would say, it's okay. Remember, it doesn't have to go out. If it's live, I don't think most people like being seen to be out of control, and crying is out of control. So I don't like the kind of interviewer that's really trying to make people cry. So I used to sort of swerve away from it. There was a fascinating one once when we had several people at once on the midweek programme. We had Princess Margaret's son, Viscount Linley, the furniture maker, who was great fun to talk to. And we also had, at the end of the table, Monty Roberts, the horse whisperer. And Monty Roberts heard Linley talking about Lord Snowdon, his father, and how supportive and absolutely loving and a model to him he was. And I looked down the end of the table and Monty Roberts was crying. He was just beginning to cry very quietly. His own father had been very problematic. And at that moment, I sort of looked at him and I thought, does he want this acknowledging or not? It was radio, of course, so not television. And so I looked at him and he did sort of say, listening to that has made me remember my own father and how difficult things were. And I'm just so moved by hearing this. And that was fine. That was two people together and so on. But on the whole, I think you need, if people are telling you a huge and emotional story, you have to let them do it. You have to let the silences happen. if they pause, not feel you have to fill the silence. Early on in an interview with anyone, you do have to fill the silence, because a lot of people are quite frightened of the silence, and they go wittering, wittering and wittering and wittering on because they can't bear to just stop. So the silence is there. It's your job to make them not awkward.
Yeah.
But
when you talk
they're emotional, once
Yeah.
you're together, once they're really telling you, once they're giving you a big slice of their life, a long silence is fine. And you can just, if you like, murmur, it's fine, it's fine. You know, and if you're in a room with them, that's easier. If you're on Zoom or a phone or something, then you have to do the whatever. And it's very interesting that when you're interviewing someone on the phone, the interviewer really has to remember to do the occasional sound. Oh yeah, like that, because people need to know they're being heard. Listen to that expression. So, but on the whole, I think most people, once you've bonded enough with them, they are okay being emotional around you. But I don't like it being milked, but that's not really a danger for your kind of interviewing.
So an answer is going on and on and on. Let's not say it's a live program when you simply have to butt in at some stage. But if it's in a recorded interview and an answer's going on and on and on, the decision that has to be made about when to butt in, it's a really difficult one. And this again crops up in training a lot as a conundrum.
Yes. Well, again, sometimes it is because they're sort of scared of silence, and you have to sort of think, if they're saying the same thing over and over and over again, you know, then you can break in quite say that's astonishing, that's interesting. Sometimes go back to what it was they last said, so they know you're listening. The fact that you're going back onto what they've just said, rather than actually you're boring me here, because you may need more of them. You may need a lot more of them. You may need on another topic, because they've given you sort of 25 minutes about the first day at the shoe factory, and actually what you want to know is about the murder. But a way to make that not offensive is to hop back to what they just sort of said. Listening to what you say there about the such and such, that's just that's fascinating, and then onto your next topic. So you just have to kind of move it on that way, but by always that feeling, yeah, I am here, I am listening to you, I am not trying to trap you, I just want to know. It's a humble thing, really. You are only a conduit. That's all you are. You are a passage, you are a pipe through which that person is getting out to what is important about them, has to go out to the world. You don't matter. You listen back to your questions, and sometimes they sound really silly, and you sound silly. I did an interview for the Radio Times the other day, and I had to transcribe it back because I was trying to get back into it. And it was a nightmare listening to myself. I hated it. And you always will. But that's not the point. On the radio, yes, live radio, quite different. Live radio, you've got to keep your questions neat and tight and not sound like a complete fool. But on something like this, doesn't matter. What you're getting is what you're getting.
Yeah, the importance of eyes when you're talking about engagement, the importance of eyes. And yet you've got your list of questions. There may be other distractions around you in a recording studio, but the importance of using your eyes and connecting with people.
And smiling slightly, not so frighteningly widely. It freaks people out, but a sort of vaguely smiling approach to things, approach to life. I would say try not to do it if you're in a really bad temper, or having a really bad hair day, or really disliking your course. In that case, if there is an available, I always say, as an available swimming pool or safe bit of river or sea, just run into it. Cold water, change your mood instantly. Because if you approach any kind of interview in a seriously bad temper or seriously bad mood, you're not going to be receptive because you're not properly interested in them. You've got to say, here is this kind of this is like gold. This person is actually going to tell me stuff. And of course, you can ask questions in this kind of operation, or indeed on the air, which you wouldn't ask socially at the school gate. I have known people for 5 years at the school gate, and then suddenly had to interview them about something they do, and discovered 3 times more about their first marriage or whatever, simply because that was a different context. British people are on the whole, they need to kind of know what the context is that they're talking in. I think that's.
Yeah, but then if we just go back, it may seem like we're going back to the beginning here, but the first point of contact, Libby, that you have with an interviewee. I mean, if we imagine the midweek studio, you've described the sort of range of types of people who would come into that studio, and they're all different types, all different mentalities, all levels of confidence. I mean, a thought or two on just how to put them at their ease quickly in an interview situation.
Well, for us, and because there were live programs on, it was the green room situation, and the ideal thing was make sure one of your guests is little Jimmy Osmond, because he used to pitch up in the green room. We had him on twice, and both times he pitched up in the green room saying, "Hey, hi," to everyone else. "What is it you do? What are you in for?" And they'd say, "I've written a book." And he'd say, "Awesome." And so he would warm them all up while I just sat back. But on the whole, yes, you have to find a point of contact. The point of contact, the kind of essential point of contact, I think probably in the kind of thing that you're doing, in fact, in any interviewing, is thank you. Thank you for helping me. Accept this puts you in the lower chair. You are the inferior. You are asking them, thank you very much for helping me with this. It may be with some people, especially if it's a meeting, a proper meeting on the spot, a proper face-to-face meeting, it can sometimes help to find some small point that you absolutely know you have in common, like, I'm a Geordie too, or my granddad was from Newcastle, or whatever. Just find some tiny point that you can sort of say is yours, or it can be down to even, I like your sweater, or whatever, or just something that is both of you together. But really, more essential than that is thank you for helping me with this, because that puts you in the inferior position that you should be in. You are inferior as the interviewer. You're asking, asking for things, facts.
Yeah.
Memories are another very interesting thing. Keeping people's memories going. People have to feel quite comfortable to go back. And you're only comfortable really to go back into the depths of your old self or whatever, if you are comfortable with the person opposite you. So again, it's just a matter of trying to be that receptive figure. And very often, I mean, I've been interviewed several times, and that's an experience too. And sometimes it's a great experience, and sometimes it's a really bad experience.
When is it a bad experience?
It's a bad experience again when you don't feel that they are properly engaged. This happens when you write a book and you have to do all the local radio stations in turn from one studio in London, telling the same stories about your book or whatever. And sometimes they have not only not read your book, but they've not read any book quite clearly. And so you will get some really sort of bored questions, and that will be sort of the DJ kind of questions where they start talking about themselves. When I had this, I had this. Then you don't feel there's any space for you to think. The good questions, the good ones, are the ones who sort of follow all the rules of just being, oh, thank you, do tell me more, and a sense that somebody is listening, properly listening. That makes a good interview, in the sense that somebody is not properly listening or is judging you. And again, this is difficult because there will always be people whose stories, hell's teeth, what were you thinking? How drunk were you? Unbelievable. So you have to be not really judging. You have to think, you're not a therapist, but you have to have that same kind of, do tell me, how's that feeling, there may be a point, I don't know, it depends on the kind of thing you have to do, where you have to say, have your feelings about that changed over the years, which is a much more polite question than are you sorry about how you behaved or the job you did at the time? Have your feelings changed over the years? That's one thing. Sometimes they will say something so extraordinary that you don't quite know how to respond. I think that's a very tricky one. Sort of, that was after I killed my mother sort of stuff. At this point, you have to kind of pause and say, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, whatever. My favourite one, was just one anecdotal one. Brian Blessed. He was on midweek and he was sitting next to somebody, I think was an obstetrician, was a very famous doctor. And he just wanted attention, I think. And he said, I once delivered a baby in a park, a woman in labour under a tree, and I delivered the baby and bit through the umbilical cord with my own teeth. And here I am. We had about a minute and a half of the programme to go. This was a kind of kicker at the end. He knew that. And so my answer, the only line I've ever spoken on the radio that I am genuinely proud of, was my answer to that, which was, Brian, am I believing this?
Yes. But in general, that does raise the question of when somebody says something that you know is historically wrong, and it may not be a contentious subject really at all, and yet it is something that you know to be wrong. If, say, you were working on our oral history of people who worked at the de Havilland Aircraft Company, and there's some detail that's wrong. The art of challenging without seeming that you're challenging, it's a difficult one, isn't it?
I think, did you see that happen? What do you remember about when it happened? If it may be somebody saying that in general things happened, you can sort of say how often do you remember cases of that happening? And that's just interest. Yeah, I think you have to not put people off with saying, well, that didn't happen, which you would do on the Today programme or something. You'd say, yeah, I'm afraid the figures don't actually support that, Minister. But you're not in that business, are you? In your kind of business, you just tell me more and more and more, and then you kind of take it back, and say, well, this is an extraordinary story. Sometimes it may turn out that it was actually true. This can happen. There was a legend in my husband's family. All the old ladies would sort of say, well, so-and-so, oh, your dad, yes, oh, yeah, well, he went into the hospital, and they had to take his brain out and freeze it and put it back in again. And that was all considered to be absolute rubbish. He has lately discovered that, indeed, this chap was a victim of absolutely pioneering surgery in which they do actually freeze a part of the brain momentarily with something. Anyway, basically, it was exaggerated, but it was part of medical history. Yeah. And he'd been assuming it was old ladies talking rubbish all the time.
But there is that phrase that you hear people say, well, if it's true for somebody, then it's true.
Well, not if it's about something was happening at the de Havilland Aircraft Factory. No, there's no such thing as your truth. There's your perception. All any of us has got is perceptions, and what we are collecting is people's perceptions. And you can obviously challenge them if it's absolutely enormous thing. You can sort of say, do you know why has that stayed in your mind? Does it connect with anything else that? Was there anything else like that? And then you may kind of get into a quite awkward sort of area where actually they kind of know they made it up or they dreamed it or something. Sometimes it helps if an interviewer says, sometimes it's, with things like that, sometimes it's hard to know whether one's dreamed it. I've heard somebody do that, and that was very clever because actually the person said, well, actually, yes, I feel that way myself. It's not quite solid in my mind. Memories, long distant memories. I mean, all our memories are very, very subjective. Yeah. I was thinking last night about that I couldn't remember. I was trying to think how early are my first memories. And one of them, I think, may have been fed to me by my mother. I may have been told that I did that or said that, and then I tried to trawl back and think, yes, actually what I think happened was, but what I do remember is, and it's always a very tiny thing, it's always a tiny detail that is the real memory, whereas the big thing, I believe that I had an imaginary friend called the Wicked Stepdriver because my parents joked about it for years, but I don't remember the Wicked Stepdriver, but I do remember another imaginary friend I had who I didn't speak about very much, but who lived down the bottom of a garden we had in Thailand. And that was a kind of secret that's in my head. So people's memories, you have to accept that. And when you're just talking to people, you have to accept that is what they said. That is how it seemed to them.
This has been absolutely fascinating, Libby. Just a couple of additional things. Just going back to the beginning where you talked about particular interviewers that you admired or didn't admire. And I mean, obviously enough, I suggest to students and other people that I train that they should listen or watch interviews on radio and
Mm.
television. And sometimes I think to myself, is that actually a good idea? And I just wonder what your overall feeling is about the standard of interviewing on radio, television. Obviously, it's a whole range of different types of context, but even so, what do you feel?
Well, I have to say, when my son died, he died, as you may know, by suicide. I was only one interviewer. They wanted a thing about the book, his book, which I had edited, and so on, his writings. And I said, I'll do Woman's Hour if it's Jenny Murray. Jenny Murray, quite remarkable, because Jenny Murray's, if is any in the archive, there must be short, calm, dispassionate, well phrased questions. No showing off at all. And I think the showing off has become absolutely epidemic. And you maybe should listen to some old interviews, because now there is a huge personality thing. There is this dreadful thing called a radio personality and television personality. And, you know, if you're doing a game show with a shiny floor and prizes, then that's fine, that's necessary. It's not really necessary in interviewers. And so old ones, Jeremy, John, Paxman, John Pittman, old television was terrific. As I say, Jenny Murray was absolutely excellent. I think quite, I mean, just you have to kind of go back a bit to when people were a tiny bit more formal and realize how well that could work for some of them. You know, some of the old who were Gilbert Harding kind of period ones, that's television, that's very different. So I think not to be caught up in this modern thing of both the people in the room are kind of fabulously interesting and fun, and one of them is you. And it doesn't work.
Yeah, but what damage is done by that sort of interviewing, would you say?
Uh, that it raises so many expectations in the other person that they ought to be like you. Fun guy is interviewing me, so I must be fun guy too. And this means that quite a lot of the interesting things they have to say, which are not fun at all, but are interesting and properly felt, won't get out because you're being fun guy. And I think also the very soupy, over sympathetic. Oh, I feel with you. I feel with you. You don't necessarily want them to feel with you. You want them to walk alongside you, but not keep hugging you. You know, nobody wants constant hugs from total strangers. So I think all those things have to be watched out for. You can sort of listen, and sometimes it's worth listening to a program and thinking, you know what, I really don't think she is getting you know, getting out of that. Why didn't you ask that? And also, why didn't you listen? Why didn't you listen to the last answer? You know, because that last answer was the kicker. So I think just being aware and listening to people around you, and realizing that it's not quite the chat that you have with your mates where you're all constantly jumping in and out. It's not like that. You know, you are in a very you're a step back. Go back to that word humble. You're sitting in the lower chair and thanking them for being willing to talk to you. That's it. It's a different kind of conversation. It can be a conversation. It can really grow into one, but it doesn't always. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to.
I think one of the most heartwarming moments in my time at the university was when one student, for a video that we were making about the benefits of oral history, said one of the great things about doing oral history and learning interviewing skills, interaction skills, was that it changed my relationships with people generally. It affected my personal life. And I'm wondering if, looking back over all these decades, you might say that your interviewing skills and your developing awareness of them has actually changed you as a person.
Oh, I've been held together in many professional and personal disasters, you know, right up to tragedies, held together by the people I have known and met and interviewed. It's a good thing to do that. No, people say the most extraordinary and wonderful things sometimes. They really do. And I remember asking David Attenborough about. He was talking about wildlife. He's always sort of said, "I do not love animals. I'm just fascinated by them." And he was saying something, and I knew he'd lost his wife a short while before, and I sort of thought, actually, just out of the top of my head came the question, do you find nature comforting? And he said the most wonderful things about just looking at a flight of geese and how seeing a flight of geese in the sky, far away and moving further away, he just realized everything was all right because geese flew. And it's just things like that, moments like that, they do change you in your life quite a lot. And it's a great thing to be able to do, and also it teaches you to listen in ordinary life, maybe to your friends more, sort of suddenly give them the treatment of actually properly listening.
Well, Libby, I could go on listening to you for forever. So many things in there that will be useful to our oral history community at the university, and hopefully much more widely than that around the world. Fingers crossed.
It's vital. Oral history is just absolutely vital.